Let's move on to our next speaker, Professor Ros Dixon, who is a globally renowned comparative constitutional scholar based in the UNSW Law Faculty. She is to co-lead the Grand Challenge on Inequality together with Professor Richard Holden, who you will see later on tonight. Her speech, Democratic Overstaying and the Fragility of Democracy. So please welcome Ros Dixon.
Like Doreen and Rob and people around the world, I haven't been sleeping quite as well since the US presidential election. Now, while the President-elect has said some encouragingly conciliatory and pragmatic things since his election, he has given many of us sleepless nights, insomnia, worrying about climate change that Matt's been talking to you about the state of race and religious tolerance today, and America's place in the world. But as a constitutional lawyer, I worried particularly about something he said in the third presidential debate against Hillary Clinton. When asked whether he would respect the results of the election, he equivocated. He said, "I'll wait and see at the time," thereby refusing to endorse one of the most critical ground rules of the democratic game: the duty to leave at the constitutionally appointed time, to respect the results of a free and fair election and leave it to others to determine what counts as fair. But lest you think this kind of anti-democratic talk by a key democratic leader is limited to Trump and the United States, you only need to look around the world today and see democracy under threat from democratically elected leaders. In Hungary, in Turkey, in Poland, democratically elected leaders are using democratic tools and institutions to gut democracy from the inside. In Nicaragua, in Venezuela, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, democratically elected presidents are using democratic tools, such as constitutional amendment and other mechanisms, to undermine the separation of powers and democracy and the limits on their own term in office and power. Democracy is newly fragile around the world. So some might say, maybe in the spirit of Craig's remarks earlier, what's so great about democracy anyway? We're living at a moment of Brexit, of Trump, people being systematically disillusioned with mainstream political choice and turning away from some of the most important institutions of the post-World War II era: Europe, globalisation, global ties. In this moment, there is a legitimate question about the limits of democracy. But to turn away from it under pressure, to me, is to forget why we are committed to in the first place, which is it's not simply a pragmatic commitment, it reflects a very deep political commitment, a commitment to freedom and equality among citizens and how we order our collective decisions based on a commitment to equality, maximum equal participation in decision making. And if you're not persuaded by the intrinsic case, there's plenty of instrumental evidence. You don't have to believe in democratic peace theory in the full Kantian variety to know. There's plenty of evidence that democracies are much less likely than non-democracies to go to war with one another. Why? Because the ballot box imposes an important check against gratuitous loss of life and violence. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen has shown that democracies are systematically less likely to experience preventable humanitarian crises such as famines. In fact, no true democracy has ever had a famine. Why? Because in the face of preventable disaster, the electoral process is a pressure that forces governments to redistribute basic goods and service to avoid the disaster. So we should redouble our commitment to democracy even though it is under stress and people are disillusioned by it. And what does that mean for constitutional law and constitutional lawyers? Well, one of the ways in which we have thought about this traditionally is about law and legal institutions and how you can put democracy into constitutions in ways that protect them from temporary popular political turns against democracy. In my remaining time, I want to talk to you about 3 possible constitutional solutions or mechanisms or responses to the spectre raised by Trump's remarks in his presidential debate. But before I do, I want to suggest that for constitutional law to work effectively in this context, it needs to borrow on the insights of other disciplines, of economics, of social psychology. It needs to take the spirit of UNSomnia and the grand challenges and the interdisciplinary conversation we are all trying to foster and develop a kind of constitutional law 2.0, one that does pay attention to incentives and behavioural insights. So the first way in which constitutions protect basic democratic commitments is by putting certain provisions, free and fair elections, checks and balances, presidential term limits, into an entrenched set of clauses and giving them heightened protection against amendment or appeal. Some constitutions even make it formally impossible to amend these provisions. And what I want to suggest is this is a perfectly important and workable way of protecting democracy against certain kinds of threat. It doesn't always work. Sometimes popular leaders can stack courts and other institutions to make these guarantees toothless. Sometimes they're so powerful that they can just get rid of the Constitution and start again, not simply by military coup, but even by democratic means, as happened in Ecuador. But in many cases, these sorts of limits have worked. In India, they worked in ways that were very important in constraining Prime Minister Indira Gandhi in the 70s. In Colombia, they worked to allow President Uribe a second term in office, but not a third. And in that way, they have helped cement democracy in action and in equilibrium in a whole range of countries around the world. And where they have worked or succeeded, they have usually drawn on the insights of economics or incentive theory. They have tried to lay the groundwork for a future constraint or restraint in an intermediate or earlier way. So in Colombia, the court said to Uribe, you can have a second term, but don't assume that this is an unlimited right to seek re-election. Uribe, being a politician, uncertain about the future with what economists would call a relatively high discount rate, took his victory there and he said, yeah, fine, very happy to abide by the court's decision. And in doing so, he ratified and legitimised a case that laid the seeds of his own future limitation. He said, yes, I accept the decision, I respect it. And later the court came back and said, see, we told you there were some limits, now it's time to enforce them and prevent you having a third term. So one mechanism is the idea that courts can help enforce limits in constitutions and do so in ways that help protect democracy from the risk of overstaying and the risk of corrosion. The second possibility, which you see up there, is the idea of forcing a democratically elected figure to leave before he or she can come back. The idea of non-consecutive term limits. Countries around the world vary in how they do this, and of course it's most relevant in presidential systems. But there are 16 countries around the world that have this idea of a non-consecutive term limit. And it's worked in Brazil, it's worked in Panama, it probably will work in Ecuador, to force a popular, strong leader to leave and create some kind of breathing space for democracy. And why does it work? Because again, it draws on the insights of other disciplines. It gives leaders an incentive to comply. It gives them some skin in the game. It means there's something to lose by disrespecting the Constitution, by gaining a reputation for lawlessness and an unwillingness to respect constitutional limitations. And it also draws on the insights of social psychology, who social psychologists have shown in the lab and in the real world that there's a fundamental difference between imagining things and living them, between what they call decision utility and experience utility. And when we're living under a strong man or woman who tells us, we are completely unable to change, I am essential to your well-being, it's hard to know whether that's true or not, to imagine what it would look like to live without a Putin or a Correa or a Chavez. And forcing the person to leave gives the opportunity to the public to know what it's like to live under a different regime and to actually experience, not in every case, but in many cases, the fact that it is indeed quite possible to live with different leadership and sometimes to do better under it. And these insights show us why the non-consecutive idea can be so powerful in limiting very, very popular figures who don't want to leave and don't want to respect constitutional limitations. Now, of course, it can't work if you can just get your friend, Medvedev, Putin's mate in Russia, or your spouse or someone else to mind the seat for you. So that if you allow someone to exit but to keep the seat warm in the meantime, it really can't work. So it has to extend to a kind of familial anti-nepotism requirement and prevent a person holding a meaningful office in the country. But it has been shown to work, and it can work in part because of these behavioural and incentive-based insights. The third possibility I want to talk about is something that's as yet untried, and that is drawing on the insights that we have from incentive-based theory to understand how we can use incentives and prizes, what economists might call carrots as well as sticks, to change democratic behaviour. So you see up there a picture of President Santos and President Obama getting the Nobel Prize for Peace. They didn't get this prize for achieving peace, right? Obama hasn't created peace in the Middle East in our time. President Santos, at the time he recently got the award, had just failed to achieve peace with the Colombian guerrillas by developing a peace plan that a majority of Colombian voters rejected. So we use prizes not just to reward past behaviour, but also to encourage effort and future behaviour. To say, we want you to work toward this goal and invest your reputation in the idea of this prize. And you could imagine a similar idea for democracy. After all, if people can use prizes and rewards to quit smoking, to lose weight, to do all sorts of mundane day-to-day things, we may find that it's possible to use it in even more important ways to give leaders an incentive to leave democracy as strong or stronger than when they came to office, and most important, to leave at the constitutionally appointed time. Now, if we were to use money to do this, it would be very expensive. Being in office offers a range of rewards: reputational, power, financial, sometimes legitimate, sometimes illegitimate. And even if we were to take out of the prize pool countries like Australia that seem to have a problem not of democratic overstaying, but of understaying or an inability to keep a Prime Minister for more than a few months, we would still have a very hefty bill. So one could imagine trying to look for other ways of doing this, softer rewards, reputational rewards that draw on the insights of the prize system, of the Nobel, of the Gong in Australia, the city prizes, to say we want to celebrate publicly, collectively, in ways that draw on art, that draw on the kind of visual celebration we have tonight, to celebrate people who respect democracy and leave when they are supposed to. A kind of virtual Cooperstown for democracy, right? The baseball Hall of Fame. And while this hasn't been tried, I'm hoping that after tonight I might persuade some of you to join me in making such a project real and possible. Democracy has had long-standing success in countries around the world, but President Trump said something recently that should make us all worry. If in 4 to 8 years he says something similar, we should be very, very deeply worried. But regardless, he has helped point us to a danger that is occurring all around the world. The danger of democratic corrosion and overstaying by democratically elected leaders. The job of constitutional lawyers, such as myself, is to spend our waking hours thinking about how law and legal institutions can draw on the insights of other disciplines and their own successes to figure out ways we can stop it.